The guests believed they were about to witness the wedding of the year. Hundreds of influential business leaders, celebrities, politicians, and wealthy investors filled the grand ballroom of a luxurious estate just outside New York City. Crystal chandeliers illuminated every corner of the room, while a string orchestra played softly in the background. Outside, a line of luxury cars stretched for what seemed like forever, with private security carefully checking every guest who entered. At the center of it all stood Ethan Carter, one of America's youngest self-made billionaires. Calm on the outside, yet carrying a weight no one in that room could understand. He waited quietly at the altar for the woman he loved. She wasn't the daughter of a wealthy family. She didn't come from privilege. Only months earlier, she had been standing on crowded sidewalks selling flowers just to buy medicine for her sick mother. Her name was Emily Brooks, and almost nobody inside that magnificent hall believed she belonged there. The whispers spread from one table to another. Some questioned Ethan's judgment. Others insisted the marriage had to be a carefully planned publicity stunt. A few even claimed Emily must have deceived him. Then, just as the music changed and every guest rose to welcome the bride, a sharply dressed woman suddenly stood up from the front row. Her voice echoed through the silent ballroom. "You don't know who she really is." The room froze. Every eye turned toward her. The musicians stopped playing. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. Ethan slowly turned around while Emily remained frozen in place, unable to move. Whatever was about to happen threatened to destroy everything they had built together. What happened next left that room in complete disbelief because this love story was built on sacrifice, painful secrets, betrayal, and one simple act of kindness that changed two lives forever. Before we go any deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why one accusation was enough to silence an entire ballroom filled with some of the richest and most powerful people in America, we have to go back to a time before the expensive suits, before the flashing cameras, before the headlines, and before anyone had ever imagined that a billionaire would risk everything for a woman whose greatest possession was a bucket of fresh flowers on a busy street corner. This story is inspired by countless real-life accounts of relationships that crossed social and economic boundaries, where wealth, status, public opinion, and personal sacrifice collided in ways few people could have imagined. While the names and some identifying details have been changed to protect privacy, the emotions, struggles, and choices reflected throughout this story are drawn from situations that have happened to real people. What you're about to hear isn't simply a love story. It's a story about trust being tested, appearances hiding the truth, and how a single decision made in a moment of compassion can change the course of two completely different lives forever. If you had walked through downtown Boston on an ordinary weekday morning, there was a good chance you would have passed Emily Brooks without ever noticing her. Thousands of people hurried through those same sidewalks every single day, carrying briefcases, coffee cups, shopping bags, and endless lists of places they needed to be. Most never looked up long enough to notice the young woman standing beside a small wooden flower cart, arranging roses, lilies, daisies, and sunflowers with extraordinary care. To them, she was simply another street vendor blending into the city's routine. But every flower she held represented something much greater than a sale. Every bouquet carried the hope that she would earn enough money before sunset to pay another medical bill, purchase another prescription, or put another meal on the table at the tiny apartment she shared with her mother. Her story was invisible to almost everyone who walked past her, yet it was a story built on determination, sacrifice, and quiet resilience. Emily had not always imagined this life for herself. As a little girl, she dreamed of becoming an elementary school teacher. She loved books, adored children, and believed education could change lives. Her teachers often praised her patience and kindness, telling her she had a gift for making people feel valued. She worked hard throughout high school, earned respectable grades, and even received acceptance into a local college. For a brief moment, it seemed as though everything she had worked toward was finally within reach. Then life took a direction she never expected. Her father, A construction worker known for his honesty and relentless work ethic was killed in a workplace accident that left the family emotionally shattered and financially devastated. Overnight, every carefully planned dream became secondary to survival. Bills accumulated faster than they could be paid. Savings disappeared within months, and the responsibility of holding the family together slowly shifted onto Emily's shoulders. The loss became even more difficult when her mother, Margaret Brooks, began experiencing persistent health problems. What started as occasional exhaustion soon developed into a serious chronic illness requiring frequent hospital visits, expensive medication, and constant monitoring. Without adequate insurance coverage, every doctor's appointment became another financial burden. Emily watched her mother apologize repeatedly for becoming dependent on her, but she never allowed those apologies to continue. Instead, she reminded Margaret that families existed to carry one another through difficult seasons. She quietly postponed college, promising herself she would return one day. Days became months. Months became years. That promise remained alive inside her heart, but each passing year made it feel increasingly distant. Every morning began long before sunrise. While most of the city remained asleep, Emily was already awake, preparing for another day. She visited the wholesale flower market before dawn, carefully selecting the freshest blooms she could afford. She learned which flowers survived cold mornings, which lasted longest in summer heat, and which arrangements attracted the attention of office workers rushing toward nearby skyscrapers. Every dollar mattered. Buying too many flowers meant risking unsold inventory. Buying too few meant missing opportunities. It was a delicate balance she mastered through experience rather than formal business education. By 7 o'clock, she was already standing at her familiar corner. Some mornings were encouraging. A businessman might purchase flowers for his anniversary. A young father might surprise his daughter with a bouquet after school. Newly engaged couples occasionally stopped to celebrate with roses. Those moments reminded Emily that kindness still existed. Yet many other days were far less hopeful. People ignored her completely. Some avoided eye contact as though acknowledging her existence would somehow slow their schedules. Others assumed she lacked ambition simply because they saw her selling flowers. A few even spoke carelessly within earshot, wondering why someone her age wasn't pursuing a real career. They never imagined that she had already sacrificed the future she wanted in order to protect the only family she had left. Despite everything, Emily refused to allow disappointment to harden her heart. She greeted strangers with the same warm smile each morning. She thanked customers whether they bought a single flower or an entire arrangement. When elderly pedestrians struggled with heavy bags, she often stepped away from her cart to help them cross the street. If she noticed someone looking discouraged, she occasionally handed them a flower without asking for payment. Some accepted with surprise. Others tried to refuse, insisting they couldn't take something for free. Emily always answered the same way. Everyone deserves a reason to smile. She never realized those simple words would eventually become unforgettable to someone whose entire world had been built on wealth, but starved of genuine compassion. Neighbors who knew Emily often wondered how she maintained such optimism. They had seen the overdue notices slipped beneath her apartment door. They knew about the hospital visits. They watched her work 7 days a week without taking vacations or buying anything for herself. Yet they rarely heard her complain. Her greatest concern was always whether her mother had enough medication, enough groceries, and enough comfort to make it through another week. She believed that difficult seasons eventually passed, even when there was no evidence suggesting they would. As another busy afternoon approached, Emily straightened the bouquets one more time and glanced toward the endless stream of traffic moving through the city. It looked like every other ordinary day. Office workers hurried past. Taxi horns echoed through the streets. Delivery trucks stopped and started at every intersection. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet only a few miles away, another life was following a completely different routine. A man surrounded by unimaginable wealth was about to make a decision that would place him on the very sidewalk where Emily stood. Neither of them could possibly know that before the day was over, their worlds would quietly begin moving toward each other, setting in motion a chain of events that neither money nor fate could ever reverse. Only a handful of people in America truly understood the scale of Ethan Carter's success. Financial magazines regularly placed him among the country's most influential entrepreneurs. Business networks analyzed every major decision he made. Investors followed his interviews as though each sentence could predict the future of the stock market. By the age of 36, Ethan had built a business empire that stretched across technology, commercial real estate, logistics, and renewable energy. His companies employed tens of thousands of people across multiple states, and his name appeared on lists celebrating innovation, leadership, and extraordinary wealth. To the outside world, he represented the American dream brought to life, a man who had transformed a small startup into one of the nation's fastest-growing corporations. Yet the image presented to the public revealed only a fraction of the man he had become. Long before the tailored suits, private aircraft, and multi-million-dollar boardrooms, Ethan's childhood looked remarkably ordinary. He grew up in a modest neighborhood outside Cleveland, Ohio, where his father worked as a mechanic and his mother taught music at a public elementary school. Money was always carefully managed. Vacations were rare, expensive purchases required months of planning, and every family member understood the importance of hard work. Ethan often credited those early years for teaching him discipline. He remembered watching his parents stretch every paycheck without complaining, determined to provide stability even during difficult times. Their example shaped his understanding of responsibility long before he earned his first dollar. As a teenager, Ethan displayed an unusual curiosity about computers and engineering. While many of his classmates spent weekends at sporting events or shopping malls, he spent hours taking apart old electronics and teaching himself how software worked. Teachers noticed his ability to solve complex problems with remarkable patience. Friends admired his ambition, though few imagined where it would eventually lead. After graduating from college with a degree in computer engineering, Ethan launched a small technology company from a rented office barely large enough for 4 employees. The beginning was anything but glamorous. He worked through countless nights, survived on little sleep, and accepted repeated failures as part of building something meaningful. Investors rejected him more times than he cared to remember. Potential clients ignored his proposals. There were months when he questioned whether he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Then came the breakthrough. A software platform his team had spent years developing suddenly attracted national attention after solving a major problem for several large corporations. Contracts multiplied almost overnight. Revenue climbed at a pace few analysts could explain. Within a decade, Ethan had expanded far beyond software, acquiring companies across multiple industries and transforming his small startup into a business empire worth billions of dollars. Newspapers celebrated his intelligence. Television hosts praised his vision. Industry leaders sought his advice. Yet every achievement brought a new layer of public attention that slowly began changing the way people interacted with him. Success introduced a different kind of loneliness. Conversations became increasingly difficult to trust. Invitations arrived from people who had shown no interest in him years earlier. Business dinners often felt less like friendships and more like negotiations disguised as social gatherings. Every compliment carried the uncomfortable question of whether it was genuine or motivated by his financial status. Ethan gradually found himself wondering whether anyone truly saw him beyond the wealth attached to his name. Those doubts became even stronger after his engagement to a woman named Victoria Reynolds ended in spectacular fashion. To the public, they appeared to be the perfect couple. Magazine covers featured glamorous photographs of them attending charity galas and exclusive events. Reporters described them as a modern success story, combining beauty, intelligence, and influence. Few people knew what was happening away from the cameras. As their relationship progressed, Ethan began noticing conversations centered less on building a future together and more on expanding luxury purchases, increasing public visibility, and securing greater financial advantages. At first, he dismissed those concerns as misunderstandings. Eventually, the evidence became impossible to ignore. The relationship collapsed after Ethan discovered confidential messages revealing discussions about protecting access to his fortune rather than protecting their relationship. The emotional impact reached far beyond heartbreak. It shattered his confidence in his own judgment. For months afterward, he questioned every interaction, every compliment, and every expression of affection. He wondered whether genuine love still existed for someone whose financial success had become impossible to separate from his identity. Rather than becoming bitter, Ethan made a quiet decision that almost nobody around him understood. Whenever possible, he began leaving behind the symbols that immediately revealed his wealth. Instead of traveling with a visible security team, he occasionally drove alone. Instead of introducing himself as the chief executive of a billion-dollar corporation, he simply introduced himself as Ethan. He chose modest clothing, avoided conversations about business, and observed how people treated him when they believed he was just another ordinary professional. Those moments became rare opportunities to experience honest human interaction free from assumptions about money. His closest advisors considered the habit unnecessary and even risky. Several warned that moving around without the usual attention to security exposed him to unwanted danger. Ethan listened respectfully, but continued anyway. He believed that if he could no longer distinguish genuine kindness from calculated ambition, then all the wealth he had accumulated meant very little. On a rainy Thursday evening, rain poured relentlessly across the city, turning busy sidewalks into rivers of reflected lights and blurred shadows. Drivers grew impatient as traffic crawled through the evening rush. Horns echoed from every direction while pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas, determined to reach somewhere warm and dry. Ethan Carter stood beside his disabled SUV, staring at the dashboard as another unsuccessful attempt to restart the engine ended with nothing more than silence. He reached for his phone to call roadside assistance, only to discover that the heavy storm had disrupted the cellular signal. He tried again. Nothing. Around him, hundreds of people passed without slowing down. Some glanced briefly before continuing on their way. Others never looked at all. For the first time in a long while, the billionaire whose schedule was usually managed down to the minute found himself standing alone in the rain with no assistant, no driver, no security team, and no one recognizing who he was. It was an unfamiliar feeling, yet strangely peaceful. Across the street, Emily Brooks noticed the stalled vehicle almost immediately. Business had been slow since the rain began. Most people had already packed up and gone home, but she had remained, hoping to sell enough flowers to cover another portion of her mother's medication. Her shoes were soaked, her jacket offered little protection from the cold, and only a handful of roses remained in the bucket beside her cart. She watched as several people walked past the stranded driver without offering help. For a brief moment, she hesitated. She couldn't afford to lose another sale, and every minute spent away from her stand reduced her chances of earning enough money that evening. Yet something inside her refused to let her ignore someone who appeared to need help. She carefully gathered the remaining flowers beneath a plastic covering and crossed the street through the steady rain. As she approached, Ethan looked up, expecting perhaps another passerby asking for directions. Instead, he saw a young woman holding a single red rose. Water dripped from the edges of her hair, yet she smiled as though the weather hardly mattered. "Looks like you're having a rough evening," she said gently. Ethan managed a small smile. "You could say that." Emily glanced toward the silent vehicle before extending the rose toward him. "I know it sounds strange," she said, "but sometimes a flower makes a bad day feel a little less heavy." Ethan looked at the flower, then back at her. "I should probably buy it first." Emily shook her head. "No, this one's already paid for." He frowned slightly. "Paid for by who?" She smiled. "By kindness." For several seconds, Ethan simply stared at her. During years of attending high-profile events and conducting billion-dollar negotiations, he had received expensive gifts from influential people hoping to gain something in return. Luxury watches, rare artwork, invitations to exclusive gatherings. He had seen it all. Yet no gesture had ever felt as genuine as the simple flower now resting in front of him. A stranger with very little had chosen to give away something she could have sold because she believed someone else's difficult day mattered more than the small amount of money she might earn. He accepted the rose carefully. "Thank you," he said quietly. Emily nodded. "I hope tomorrow treats you better." She turned to leave before Ethan stopped her. "Wait." She looked back. "What's your name?" "Emily." "I'm Ethan." She smiled again. "Well, Ethan, good luck." Then she walked back through the rain toward her flower cart without asking another question, without requesting anything in return, and without realizing she had just left an unforgettable impression on one of the wealthiest men in America. Ethan stood motionless for a moment, watching her disappear into the rain. Something about the encounter stayed with him. It wasn't simply the flower. It was the complete absence of expectation. She hadn't recognized him. She hadn't asked what he did for a living. She hadn't hinted at needing money or assistance. She had simply seen another human being having a difficult moment and responded with compassion. It was the kind of sincerity Ethan had spent years searching for but rarely encountered. A few minutes later, roadside assistance finally arrived and towed the SUV to a nearby service center. Ethan returned home, but the events of the evening refused to leave his mind. As he placed the slightly rain-soaked rose into a glass of water on his kitchen counter, he realized something unusual. He couldn't remember the last time a brief conversation with a complete stranger had occupied his thoughts for so long. The following morning, during a meeting with senior executives discussing an acquisition worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Ethan found himself distracted. Charts filled the conference room screens. Lawyers discussed contracts. Financial analysts reviewed projections. Yet his thoughts kept returning to a flower seller standing in the rain, giving away one of the few roses she had left. His assistant noticed his unusual silence. "Everything all right?" Ethan nodded automatically. "Yes, just thinking." He wasn't thinking about business. He was thinking about Emily. Meanwhile, Emily continued her routine exactly as she always had. She never mentioned the encounter to anyone because, to her, it wasn't remarkable. Helping people was simply part of who she was. She had no idea that the man whose evening she had quietly changed was now asking himself questions he hadn't considered in years. Questions about trust, about happiness, about whether genuine goodness still existed in a world where almost every relationship seemed influenced by wealth or status. That single meeting should have ended as nothing more than a pleasant memory shared by two strangers. Instead, less than 48 hours later, Ethan would make a decision that would bring him back to the same street corner. And this time, it wouldn't be because his car had broken down. For the next 2 days, Ethan Carter tried to convince himself that he was simply overthinking an ordinary encounter. After all, people crossed paths with strangers every day. A brief conversation on a rainy evening should have faded from memory as quickly as the storm itself. Yet every time he looked at the red rose sitting in the small glass vase on his kitchen counter, he found himself replaying Emily's words. "This one's already paid for, by kindness." They were simple words, but they carried a sincerity he hadn't heard in years. In boardrooms, every sentence usually had a purpose. Every compliment came with an expectation. Every introduction opened the door to another proposal or investment opportunity. Emily had wanted nothing. She had simply been kind. By Friday afternoon, Ethan made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of heading directly home after work, he instructed his assistant to cancel his evening appointments. His driver assumed another business meeting had been added to the schedule, but Ethan simply asked to be dropped several blocks away from the downtown flower district. He wore a plain navy jacket, blue jeans, and a baseball cap, leaving behind the expensive watches and tailored suits that often attracted attention. To anyone passing by, he looked like another office worker finishing a long week. As he approached the familiar street corner, he immediately spotted the small wooden flower cart. Emily was arranging fresh sunflowers beside buckets filled with roses and lilies, greeting customers with the same warm smile he remembered from the rainy night. She seemed completely unaware that anyone extraordinary had entered her day. Ethan paused across the street for several moments, watching quietly. He wasn't studying her appearance as much as her character. An elderly man approached the cart carrying a worn grocery bag. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket, counting loose coins one by one. After several seconds, he sighed softly and apologized. "I'm short today," the man admitted. "My wife loves yellow flowers. It's our anniversary, but I guess I'll have to come back next week." Without hesitation, Emily selected the largest sunflower from the display, wrapped it carefully, and placed it gently into his hands. "Your wife shouldn't have to wait for her anniversary," she said with a smile. The man looked confused. "I can't afford this." "I know. But just promise me you'll tell her she's loved." The man's eyes filled with emotion as he thanked her repeatedly before walking away, still holding the flower as though it were something priceless. Ethan watched the entire exchange from a distance. Nobody else seemed to notice. The pedestrians continued rushing past, unaware that they had just witnessed an act of generosity from someone who could barely afford generosity herself. He crossed the street. Emily looked up and smiled politely. "Hi." "Hi," Ethan replied. "You survived the rain." He laughed. "Barely." She smiled. "I was hoping your car made it home." "It did." "I'm glad." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan glanced toward the flowers. "I think I owe you one rose." Emily tilted her head. "Oh me, you gave me one for free." She laughed softly. "I don't keep track of things like that." "Well, I do." She picked up a fresh red rose. "Then today you can buy one." He reached into his wallet and handed her a $20 bill. Emily looked at the price tag. "The rose is only $6. "I know." She immediately searched for change. Ethan stopped her. "Keep it." Emily gently shook her head. "I can't." "Why not?" "Because you paid for one flower, not 3. She counted the correct change into his hand before placing the rose inside a paper sleeve. Ethan couldn't help smiling. "You really don't make this easy." She looked puzzled. "Make what easy?" "Helping you." Emily's expression softened. "If someone needs help, I appreciate it." She glanced toward another customer approaching the stand. "But I don't like taking more than I've earned." That answer stayed with Ethan long after he left. Over the following weeks, visiting the flower cart quietly became part of his routine. Sometimes he stopped on Monday afternoons. Other times, it was Wednesday mornings before meetings. Occasionally, he arrived just before sunset when Emily was preparing to close. Each visit lasted only a few minutes at first. They talked about the weather, the changing seasons, favorite flowers, books they enjoyed reading, and places they hoped to visit someday. Remarkably, Emily never once asked where he worked. She never searched his name online. She never questioned why he occasionally disappeared for several days before returning again. She accepted him exactly as he presented himself, simply Ethan. That simplicity became something he looked forward to more than any business success. As the conversations grew longer, Ethan learned about Emily's mother and the medical treatments that consumed nearly every dollar she earned. He discovered that Emily loved reading classic American novels borrowed from the public library because buying books wasn't a luxury she could afford. He learned that every Sunday afternoon, no matter how exhausted she felt, she volunteered at a neighborhood soup kitchen because she believed difficult circumstances should never prevent someone from helping others. Emily also learned small pieces about Ethan, though not the whole truth. He told her he worked in business consulting, which wasn't entirely false. He admitted he traveled often. He confessed that he sometimes found it difficult to trust people because of painful experiences in the past. Emily never pressed for details. Instead, she simply said, "Sometimes people disappoint us. But if we stop believing there are good people left, the ones who truly care never get the chance to prove it." Those words lingered in Ethan's mind for days. For the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to ordinary conversations instead of multi-million-dollar negotiations. He laughed more. He slept better. Even his executive team noticed the difference. "What changed?" one board member asked after a meeting. "You seem happier." Ethan smiled. "I met someone." The room erupted with surprised laughter. "Really? What's she like?" Ethan paused before answering. "The kindest person I've ever met." Meanwhile, several miles away, another pair of eyes had quietly begun paying attention. Someone had noticed that one of the most powerful businessmen in America kept disappearing from his carefully managed schedule. Someone wanted to know exactly where he was going. And once that investigation began, Emily Brooks would unknowingly become the center of a dangerous plan that threatened to destroy everything before either of them even realized they had fallen. In every circle of extraordinary wealth, there are people whose influence comes from money, others whose influence comes from power, and a select few who understand how to use both at the same time. Vanessa Harrington belonged to that last group. Elegant, intelligent, and remarkably persuasive, she had spent years building relationships with corporate executives, politicians, investors, and media personalities. She was the daughter of a successful real estate developer and had grown up attending charity galas, private auctions, and exclusive country clubs where billion-dollar deals were often discussed over dinner. From an early age, Vanessa learned that reputation could open doors just as easily as wealth. She also learned that appearances often mattered more than truth. For nearly 3 years, the public had assumed Vanessa and Ethan Carter would eventually marry. They were frequently photographed together at fundraising events, business conferences, and award ceremonies. Newspapers described them as close friends with an undeniable connection. Television commentators speculated about engagement announcements almost every few months. Neither Ethan nor Vanessa publicly corrected those assumptions. While Ethan viewed her as a trusted acquaintance from the business world, Vanessa quietly viewed him very differently. She believed that becoming Mrs. Ethan Carter was simply a matter of time. Very few people knew how determined she had become. Vanessa admired Ethan's intelligence, but admiration alone wasn't driving her ambition. She understood exactly what a marriage to one of America's wealthiest entrepreneurs would represent. It would place her at the center of one of the country's most influential business empires. It would strengthen her family's position, expand her own social influence, and secure a future few people could even imagine. Over time, those expectations transformed into certainty. In her mind, there was no reasonable alternative. Ethan belonged in her world. Someone like him could never possibly choose a woman with no connections, no fortune, and no place among the nation's elite. That confidence began to crack during an executive fundraising dinner held in Manhattan. Vanessa noticed something unusual. Throughout the evening, Ethan appeared distracted. He glanced at his watch repeatedly. He left earlier than expected. Most people assumed another urgent business matter required his attention. Vanessa wasn't convinced. She had known Ethan long enough to recognize subtle changes in his behavior. He smiled more than usual. His conversation seemed lighter. The guarded expression that had followed him since the collapse of his previous engagement had slowly disappeared. It wasn't the attitude of a man consumed by business. It was the attitude of someone thinking about another person. At first, Vanessa dismissed the thought. Then it happened again and again. Board meetings ended early. Dinner invitations were politely declined. Weekend golf outings disappeared from his schedule. For someone whose calendar had once been planned months in advance, Ethan suddenly seemed eager to protect certain hours of his week. Vanessa's curiosity quickly became concern. Concern soon became suspicion. Rather than confronting Ethan directly, she chose another approach. She hired a private investigation firm that specialized in corporate intelligence. Officially, the assignment was simple. Document Ethan Carter's activities outside scheduled business engagements. Nothing illegal, nothing invasive beyond public observation. Just answers. Within days, investigators began following Ethan's movements whenever he left the office alone. Their reports initially revealed nothing unusual. Coffee shops, bookstores, evening walks. Then one Thursday afternoon, everything changed. One investigator photographed Ethan standing beside a modest flower cart in downtown Boston. Another captured images of him laughing with a young woman wearing a simple blue jacket and work apron. Additional photographs showed the pair sharing coffee from a nearby cafe. In another image, Ethan carried a small bouquet while Emily smiled at something he had said. There was no extravagant restaurant, no luxury shopping, no expensive gifts. Just two people talking as though the rest of the city didn't exist. When Vanessa received the report, she stared silently at the photographs spread across her office desk. She looked at Emily's worn clothing, the aging flower cart, the busy sidewalk. Then she looked at Ethan. He wasn't pretending to smile for cameras. He wasn't networking. He wasn't entertaining investors. He looked genuinely happy. It was an expression Vanessa hadn't seen in years. She turned another page. The investigator had identified the woman. Emily Brooks, age 26, street flower vendor, primary caregiver for her chronically ill mother. No criminal record. No significant financial assets. No known political or corporate connections. Lives in a small rented apartment. Works 7 days a week. Vanessa read the report twice. Then a third time. "This can't be serious," she whispered. One of her advisors sitting nearby glanced toward the file. "Who is she?" Vanessa answered without looking up. "Nobody." But even as she said the word, she knew it wasn't true. Somehow, some ordinary flower seller had captured the attention of a man surrounded every day by some of the most accomplished and attractive women in America. Vanessa couldn't understand it. She refused to accept it. Over the following week, she requested more surveillance. The reports became increasingly detailed. Emily volunteered at a neighborhood shelter. Emily visited her mother in the hospital after work. Emily donated flowers to a retirement home every month. Emily consistently refused extra money from customers who accidentally overpaid. Every report described the same thing: kindness, integrity, humility. Ironically, the investigation meant to uncover Emily's weaknesses kept revealing her strengths. That only frustrated Vanessa even more. She realized she wasn't competing against wealth. She wasn't competing against beauty. She was competing against something money couldn't easily replace: character. For the first time, Vanessa felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Fear. Not fear of Emily herself. Fear of losing everything she believed was already hers. Late one evening, Vanessa closed the investigation file and walked toward the large windows overlooking the city skyline. The lights below stretched endlessly into the distance. She stood there for several minutes before quietly making a decision that would alter all three of their lives. "If she won't walk away on her own," she said softly, "I'll make sure she has no choice." She reached for her phone. The number she dialed wasn't a friend. It wasn't a family member. It was someone whose reputation for solving difficult problems had made them very well known in certain circles. By the time that conversation ended, the first move against Emily Brooks had already begun. Emily, completely unaware, closed her flower stand that evening with the same peaceful smile she always wore, believing tomorrow would be just another ordinary day. She couldn't possibly know that somewhere across the city, someone she had never met had decided she was the greatest obstacle standing between ambition and unimaginable wealth. The first signs were so small that Emily barely noticed them. Looking back months later, she would remember them as isolated inconveniences, the kind of things anyone might dismiss as bad luck. A regular customer who bought fresh flowers every Friday suddenly stopped coming. A corporate office that usually ordered bouquets twice a month canceled without explanation. Deliveries that had always arrived on time began showing up late, leaving many of the flowers wilted before she even placed them on display. None of it seemed connected. None of it seemed important. At least, not at first. Emily had spent years believing that if she worked hard, treated people with respect, and remained honest, life would eventually reward that effort. She understood that difficult seasons came and went, but she also believed kindness had a way of finding its way back. What she didn't understand was how easily a carefully planned lie could spread through a community where people often accepted rumors without asking whether they were true. One Monday morning, as Emily arranged fresh white lilies at her flower cart, two women approached but stopped several feet away. They looked at her, whispered quietly to each other, then turned around without saying a word. Emily smiled politely anyway, assuming they had changed their minds. Similar moments continued throughout the day. Several customers glanced toward her stand before choosing another florist farther down the street. A man who had purchased flowers from her every anniversary for 4 consecutive years avoided eye contact completely. By closing time, Emily had earned less than half of what she usually made. She blamed the weather. The following day was worse. By Wednesday, She could no longer convince herself that it was merely coincidence. Late that afternoon, one of the neighboring vendors, an older man named Frank who had operated a newspaper stand for nearly 3 decades, slowly walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You've noticed it too, haven't you?" he asked quietly. Emily looked confused. "Noticed what?" Frank hesitated. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything." "Say what?" He sighed. "People have been talking." Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. "Talking about me?" Frank nodded reluctantly. "They're saying you trick wealthy men into giving you money." Emily stared at him in disbelief. "What?" "They're saying you've been pretending your mother is sick to make people feel sorry for you." Emily's face turned pale. "Who would say something like that?" Frank shook his head. "I don't know where it started. I just know I've heard it more than once." Emily tried to laugh, hoping the rumors sounded too ridiculous for anyone to believe. But as the week continued, she realized many people already had. Several longtime customers quietly disappeared. One woman returned a bouquet before leaving the sidewalk without explanation. A local cafe that occasionally displayed Emily's flowers informed her they had decided to work with another supplier. Nobody accused her directly. Nobody offered evidence. The whispers alone were enough. Across town, Ethan remained completely unaware of what was happening. The demands of a major corporate merger had occupied nearly every hour of his week. Meetings with attorneys, shareholders, and regulatory officials left him exhausted. Although he exchanged brief messages with Emily each evening, neither of them mentioned the growing problems. Emily didn't want to burden him with worries she believed she could handle herself. Ethan assumed her short replies simply reflected another busy workweek. Then came Friday morning. Emily arrived at her usual corner just after sunrise. Her flower cart was gone. For several seconds, she stood frozen. Only scattered wooden pieces remained on the sidewalk. The buckets had been overturned. Broken flower stems lay across the pavement. Fresh roses floated through dirty rainwater collecting near the curb. Someone had completely destroyed the stand she had spent years building. Emily slowly knelt beside the broken wood, picking up crushed flowers one by one. She didn't cry immediately. She simply stared. The silence felt heavier than the destruction itself. Frank rushed over from across the street. "I got here 20 minutes ago," he said breathlessly. "It was already like this." "Did anyone see who did it?" He shook his head. No cameras pointed this direction. Emily carefully lifted one damaged bouquet into her hands. Months of careful saving. Years of hard work. Hundreds of early mornings, reduced to splintered wood and broken flowers overnight. Several nearby shop owners offered sympathetic words, but none had answers. Someone had wanted to send a message, and they had succeeded. That afternoon, Emily borrowed an old folding table from a nearby church and arranged the few flowers she had managed to salvage. Business was almost non-existent. Just before closing time, her landlord called. "I'm sorry, Emily." Her heart sank. "I've waited as long as I can. I know. You're already 2 months behind. I just need a little more time. I wish I could give it to you." She closed her eyes. "Please." The landlord's voice softened. "I'll hold the apartment until the end of next week." The call ended. Emily sat quietly on the sidewalk long after the last customer had gone home. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder whether she was finally losing the fight. At that exact moment, Ethan's driver pulled up several blocks away. Ethan stepped out carrying a small paper bag. Inside was homemade soup from a restaurant Emily had once mentioned wanting to try but could never afford. He smiled as he walked toward her usual corner, already imagining her reaction. Then he saw the broken flower cart. He stopped walking. The smile disappeared. Emily quickly wiped away tears before she noticed him approaching. "Ethan." He looked from the shattered wood to the nearly empty folding table. "What happened?" Emily forced a weak smile. "I guess life happened." Ethan knelt beside the damaged pieces of the cart. His jaw tightened. This wasn't an accident. Emily remained silent. He looked directly into her eyes. "Who did this?" She slowly shook her head. "I don't know." For the first time since meeting Emily, Ethan felt something stronger than sadness. Someone had deliberately targeted the kindest person he had ever known. And as he stood there looking at the broken flowers scattered across the sidewalk, He quietly made himself a promise. Whoever had done this, he would find them. Even if discovering the truth meant revealing the identity he had worked so hard to keep hidden. That evening, Ethan barely slept. He replayed every detail of the day over and over again. The broken flower cart, Emily's trembling voice, the sadness she had tried so hard to hide behind a smile. None of it felt random. Ethan had spent years building companies where every decision depended on identifying patterns that others overlooked. Successful businesses rarely collapsed because of a single event. They failed because of a series of connected actions. As he lay awake staring at the ceiling, he began asking himself the same question that had helped him solve countless business problems. If someone wanted to hurt Emily, who would benefit from it? The following morning, Ethan arrived at headquarters earlier than anyone else. His executive office occupied the top floor of Carter Global's headquarters, offering a breathtaking view of the Boston skyline. Normally, he appreciated the quiet moments before employees arrived, but today his attention remained fixed on something else. He opened his laptop and reviewed his schedule. Meetings filled nearly every hour. Investors from California, a video conference with overseas partners, a lunch with government officials, a board presentation scheduled before sunset. None of it seemed important anymore. He pressed a button on his desk. His assistant entered moments later. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. I need every meeting canceled." She blinked in surprise. "Every meeting? Everything except emergencies." She hesitated. "The board isn't going to like that. They'll survive." Within an hour, Ethan had assembled a small team consisting of his head of corporate security, legal advisor, and longtime friend Michael Donovan, a former federal investigator who now served as Carter Global's director of security operations. Michael entered carrying a notebook. "You sounded serious." "I am." Ethan briefly explained everything. The rumors, the destroyed flower stand, the sudden loss of customers. When he finished, Michael leaned back in his chair. "You think someone targeted her because of you?" "I don't know, but I intend to find out." Michael nodded. "If someone organized this, they'll leave a trail." "What do you need?" "Time. You have it." Meanwhile, Emily continued rebuilding her life one day at a time. A local church donated a second-hand flower cart. Several neighbors volunteered to help repair it. Frank spent an entire afternoon repainting the wooden panels. Emily thanked everyone repeatedly, overwhelmed by their generosity. She refused to let bitterness replace gratitude. "If people are willing to help me stand," she told her mother that evening, "then I can't give up now." Margaret smiled proudly despite her exhaustion. "Your father always said kindness grows quietly." Emily squeezed her mother's hand. "I hope he was right." 2 days later, something happened that neither Ethan nor Emily could have predicted. A national business news network broadcast a live interview from Carter Global headquarters. The interview had been scheduled weeks earlier to discuss Ethan's latest corporate expansion. Emily rarely watched business television. She usually spent afternoons working. But on that particular day, heavy rain forced her to close early. She returned home, prepared tea for her mother, and absent-mindedly turned on the television while organizing invoices. The reporter smiled toward the camera. "We're joined today by billionaire entrepreneur Ethan Carter." Emily froze. The folder slipped from her hands onto the floor. She stared at the television. There he was. The same smile. The same voice. The same man who had spent weeks drinking coffee beside her flower stand. Except now he wore an expensive tailored suit while reporters introduced him as one of the richest businessmen in America. Photographs flashed across the screen. Private jets, corporate headquarters, international conferences, magazine covers. The interviewer continued speaking. "Worth an estimated several $billion." Emily barely heard another word. Her heart pounded. Every small detail suddenly made sense. The luxury SUV, the occasional mysterious phone calls, the confidence with which people greeted him in restaurants, the way strangers sometimes looked at him with quiet recognition before walking away. He hadn't been an ordinary consultant. He had been hiding his identity from the very beginning. Margaret noticed the expression on her daughter's face. "Emily." She couldn't answer. She simply stared at the television until the interview ended. Questions filled her mind all at once. Why didn't he tell me? Did he ever trust me? Was any of it real? Was I just another experiment? The following afternoon, Ethan arrived at the flower cart carrying coffee, exactly as he had done many times before. Emily wasn't there. He waited. An hour passed. Still nothing. Frank slowly approached. Looking for Emily? Yes. Frank hesitated. I think she knows. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. What do you mean? Frank pointed toward a newspaper lying on the bench nearby. Its front page featured Ethan's photograph beneath the headline. Carter Global announces historic expansion. Ethan closed his eyes. He understood immediately. Where is she? Frank sighed. I don't know. Ethan called her phone. No answer. He sent a message. No reply. He drove to the apartment building where she lived. The curtains remained closed. No lights. No response. For 3 days, Emily disappeared from every place they had shared together. She stopped answering messages. She stopped visiting the flower stand. Even the volunteers at the neighborhood shelter said she hadn't returned. For the first time in years, Ethan experienced a feeling he couldn't solve with money, influence, or determination. Helplessness. Every passing hour reminded him that the one decision he believed would protect their relationship had instead become the very thing threatening to destroy it. Late on the third evening, Michael Donovan walked quietly into Ethan's office carrying a thick investigation file. I've got something. Ethan looked up immediately. Did you find Emily? Michael shook his head. No. He placed the file on the desk. But I think I found the person who wanted her gone. On top of the file sat a single photograph. Ethan picked it up. His expression changed instantly. He recognized the woman without needing anyone to say her name. Vanessa Harrington. The realization struck him with devastating clarity. Emily hadn't walked away because she stopped loving him. She had walked away because he had hidden the truth. And while he had been trying to protect their relationship, someone else had been quietly working to destroy it from the very beginning. Ethan Carter stared at Vanessa Harrington's photograph for several long seconds before placing it back onto the desk. His office, usually filled with conversations about acquisitions, investments, and expansion strategies, had become unusually quiet. Michael Donovan remained standing nearby, waiting for Ethan to speak. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. Tell me everything. Michael opened the investigation file. We started with the rumors surrounding Emily. At first, they looked like random gossip, but the timing didn't make sense. The stories appeared almost simultaneously in different parts of the city. That's rarely an accident. He slid several documents across the desk. We interviewed local business owners, reviewed security footage from nearby stores, and tracked communications between a public relations consulting firm and several online accounts that were spreading false information. Ethan examined the documents carefully. Who hired them? Michael looked directly at him. The payments lead to a consulting company. And that consulting company was hired by Harrington Strategic Holdings. Ethan immediately recognized the name. Vanessa's family business. His expression hardened. Michael continued. We're still confirming every detail, but there's more. He placed another photograph on the desk. It showed 2 men standing near Emily's flower cart late at night. The timestamp matched the evening before the cart had been destroyed. They weren't trying to steal anything, Michael explained. They damaged the cart and left. Can we identify them? We already have. Michael handed over another folder. They've both worked security contracts connected to Harrington Strategic Holdings. For several moments, Ethan said nothing. He had expected jealousy. He had expected manipulation. He had never imagined someone would deliberately target a woman whose only mistake was falling in love. His voice became unusually calm. We're going to handle this the right way. Michael nodded. I figured you'd say that. No revenge. No public accusations. Only facts. Over the next several days, Ethan's legal team quietly gathered additional evidence. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses confirmed the movements of the men responsible for damaging Emily's flower cart. Financial records connected payments to a private investigation company hired shortly after Vanessa learned about Emily. Phone records showed repeated communication between Vanessa's office and the consulting firm responsible for spreading false rumors online. Piece by piece, a clear picture began to emerge. Meanwhile, Vanessa remained confident that her plan had succeeded. Emily had disappeared. Ethan had stopped visiting the flower stand. From her perspective, everything had unfolded exactly as she intended. She even accepted an invitation to attend an exclusive charity gala where Ethan was scheduled to deliver the keynote speech. The ballroom overflowed with business executives, elected officials, journalists, and investors. Television cameras lined the back of the room, broadcasting the event live across several financial news networks. Vanessa arrived wearing an elegant black evening gown, greeting familiar faces with complete confidence. She had no reason to believe the evening would be any different from dozens of similar events she had attended before. When Ethan finally stepped onto the stage, the audience applauded politely. He thanked everyone for supporting the charity before pausing unexpectedly. "There is something important I need to address tonight." The room grew noticeably quieter. Ethan looked across the audience. "For several weeks, someone very close to me has been the victim of false accusations, deliberate harassment, and vandalism." Vanessa's smile slowly faded. "I remained silent because I wanted the truth, not assumptions." He glanced toward a large presentation screen behind him. "Today, we have that truth." The screen illuminated. Security footage appeared. Two men damaging Emily's flower cart. Gasps spread through the ballroom. The next image displayed financial records. Then investigation reports. Then communication logs. Finally, photographs connecting every stage of the operation. Ethan never raised his voice. He never insulted anyone. He simply allowed the evidence to speak. When Vanessa realized where the presentation was leading, she stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous." Several journalists immediately turned their cameras toward her. Ethan remained composed. "If any of these documents are inaccurate, you'll have every opportunity to challenge them through the proper legal process." Silence filled the room. Vanessa looked around. The same executives who had greeted her warmly only minutes earlier now watched with expressions of disbelief. No one defended her. No one interrupted. The evidence was overwhelming. Without another word, Vanessa quietly walked toward the exit. Camera flashes followed her all the way out. By the following morning, news outlets across the country reported the story. Headlines focused less on Ethan's business success and more on the extraordinary lengths someone had gone to destroy the reputation of an ordinary flower seller. Public sympathy shifted almost instantly. Customers returned to Emily's flower stand. Local businesses offered to help rebuild it permanently. A construction company volunteered to design a beautiful new kiosk at no cost. Anonymous donations arrived to help cover Margaret's medical treatment. People who had once believed the rumors now apologized sincerely. Yet despite everything changing around him, Ethan found very little comfort. The public knew the truth. Vanessa's deception had been exposed. Emily's name had been cleared. But none of those victories answered the only question that still mattered. Where was Emily? Every evening after work, Ethan continued searching. He visited the flower stand, the shelter where she volunteered, the hospital where her mother received treatment, the public library she loved, coffee shops they had visited together. Each place held memories. None held Emily. Late one afternoon, just as Ethan prepared to leave another unsuccessful search, his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. He answered immediately. A gentle voice spoke from the other end. "Mr. Carter?" "Yes. My name is Sarah." Ethan waited. "I volunteer at the Hope Haven Community Shelter." His heart began racing. "I think." She paused. "I think Emily is here." Everything else disappeared from Ethan's mind. Without another question, he grabbed his car keys and rushed toward the door. After days of searching, he finally knew where she was. What he didn't know was whether she would even agree to see him. Ethan reached Hope Haven Community Shelter in less than 20 minutes, though later he could barely remember the drive. Every traffic light seemed longer than usual. Every delay felt unbearable. For days he had imagined countless conversations with Emily, rehearsing apologies that never sounded adequate. None of them could erase the fact that he had hidden the biggest truth about his life. He had convinced himself that concealing his identity would protect what they shared, but now he understood that trust could not grow where honesty was incomplete. As he stepped through the shelter's front doors, He wasn't thinking like a billionaire or a chief executive. He was simply a man hoping he hadn't lost the woman he loved. The shelter looked much like Emily had once described it. Volunteers quietly organized donated clothing. Children colored pictures at folding tables, while seniors chatted over cups of coffee. The atmosphere was calm despite the constant movement. Near the back of the building, Ethan saw her. Emily was arranging fresh flowers into small glass jars. She had donated them, just as she always had. She hadn't stopped giving. She had simply chosen a different place to do it. For several seconds, Ethan remained where he was. He watched her comfort an elderly woman sitting alone by the window before gently placing a bouquet on the table beside her. Emily smiled with the same warmth he remembered from the rainy night they first met. That smile had survived every rumor, every hardship, every disappointment. It reminded Ethan why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. Sarah, the volunteer who had called him, quietly approached. "She doesn't know you're here." Ethan nodded. "Thank you." Sarah offered a small smile before walking away, leaving them the privacy they both deserved. Emily turned, carrying another arrangement of flowers. The moment she saw Ethan, she stopped. Neither of them spoke. The room around them seemed to fade into silence. Finally, Ethan took a slow step forward. "I've been looking for you." Emily lowered her eyes. "I know. I should have told you the truth." She looked back at him, her voice calm but heavy with emotion. "Why didn't you?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Because I was afraid." Emily seemed surprised. "Afraid? I've spent years wondering whether people cared about me or about what I own. After everything that happened in my past, I stopped believing I could separate the two. Then I met you." He paused. "You treated me with kindness before you knew anything about me." Emily listened quietly. "I didn't want to lose that." She folded her hands together. "So you decided to hide who you were." "I convinced myself it was temporary. You should have trusted me enough to choose for myself." Her words landed harder than any business loss Ethan had ever experienced. He nodded slowly. "You're right. There was no excuse. No attempt to defend himself. Only acceptance. I was wrong." Emily remained silent. Ethan continued. "I can't change what I did. I can't erase the pain I caused. But I can promise you this." He looked directly into her eyes. "If I had lost every company, if I had lost every dollar, if I had never become successful, I still would have crossed that street the night my car broke down." Emily's eyes began to fill with tears. "Because the woman I fell in love with wasn't standing behind a fortune. She was standing behind a flower cart. I loved your heart long before you ever learned my last name." A long silence followed. Outside, rain gently tapped against the shelter windows, almost like an echo of the night they first met. Emily finally spoke. "When I saw you on television, I felt foolish. I kept asking myself whether every conversation we shared had been real. They were. Every one of them. I never lied about how I felt. I only lied about who I was." Emily took a slow breath. "You know what hurt the most?" Ethan shook his head. "I would have stood beside you whether you had $1 or 1 billion. Her voice trembled. "You never gave me the chance to prove it." Tears rolled down Ethan's face. For a man admired by millions for his confidence, this was the first time in years he allowed himself to cry without trying to hide it. "I know, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. I don't expect forgiveness. I only wanted you to hear the truth from me." He turned slightly, preparing to leave. "If this is goodbye, I'll respect it." He had taken only a few steps when Emily quietly called his name. "Ethan." He stopped. She walked toward him slowly. "I don't believe people should be defined by the worst decision they've ever made." He turned to face her. "I believe they should be judged by what they do afterward." She looked into his eyes. "You fought for my name when everyone else believed the lies. You never tried to buy my forgiveness. You came here with nothing except the truth." A small smile appeared through her tears. "That's the man I fell in love with." Without another word, she stepped forward and embraced him. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The volunteers nearby quietly smiled before returning to their work, understanding that some moments were too personal for applause. Weeks later, after Margaret's health had begun improving and Emily's flower business was thriving once again, Ethan asked her a question during a quiet walk through the same downtown street, where everything had started. He held out the very first red rose she had given him, pressed carefully between the pages of a journal for months. "I've carried this with me ever since that rainy night." Emily smiled, recognizing it immediately. "Ethan Carter." He lowered himself onto one knee. "This flower changed my life. You changed my life. Emily Brooks. Will you marry me?" With tears of joy filling her eyes, Emily answered the only way her heart knew how. Yes. Neither of them noticed the small crowd gathering nearby. They were too busy celebrating something far more valuable than wealth. They were celebrating a love that had survived deception, jealousy, public humiliation, and heartbreak. What neither of them realized was that their wedding day would soon become one of the most unforgettable events anyone in that city had ever witnessed. Several months passed before Ethan Carter and Emily Brooks finally chose a date for their wedding. News of their engagement had spread far beyond Boston, becoming one of the most talked about human interest stories in the country. Newspapers that usually focused on financial markets suddenly found themselves covering a love story. Morning television programs invited relationship experts to discuss why millions of people had connected so deeply with the couple's journey. Social media was filled with photographs of Emily's rebuilt flower shop, while countless strangers shared messages about how her kindness had inspired them to treat people differently. Yet through all the attention, Ethan and Emily remained remarkably unchanged. They continued visiting Hope Haven Community Shelter every week. Emily still greeted customers herself at the flower shop, refusing offers to hand the business over to professional managers. Ethan continued arriving without an entourage whenever possible, often helping arrange bouquets before the store opened. The fortune he possessed had never impressed Emily. Likewise, the growing fame surrounding their relationship never changed the simple values that had brought them together. When invitations for the wedding were finally sent, many people expected an event unlike anything the city had ever witnessed. After all, one of America's wealthiest entrepreneurs was getting married. Guests imagined helicopters landing on private estates, extravagant decorations flown in from around the world, celebrity performances, and displays of wealth that would dominate headlines for weeks. Business executives reserved hotel suites months in advance. Luxury brands quietly offered sponsorships in exchange for publicity. Even international media requested permission to cover the ceremony live. But Ethan and Emily had something entirely different in mind. The ceremony took place inside a beautifully restored botanical garden overlooking the city skyline. Elegant, timeless, and filled with natural beauty, it reflected Emily's lifelong love for flowers far more than it reflected Ethan's financial success. Fresh roses, lilies, wildflowers, and sunflowers decorated every pathway, but there was something unusual about them. Every arrangement had been grown by small family-owned flower farms struggling to stay in business. Instead of importing the world's rarest flowers, Ethan insisted on supporting local growers whose livelihoods depended on opportunities like this. It was a decision Emily appreciated deeply because she understood exactly how much every sale could mean to a small business owner. Guests arrived expecting lavish gift boxes waiting at their seats. Instead, each chair held a handwritten note. It read, "Thank you for celebrating this day with us. If you plan to give us a wedding gift, we ask one simple favor instead. Please perform one unexpected act of kindness for someone who can never repay you. That will be the greatest gift we could ever receive." Many guests quietly read the message twice. Some smiled. Others wiped tears from their eyes. When Emily appeared at the entrance wearing a simple yet elegant white gown, the entire garden stood in silence. She wasn't wearing the most expensive dress money could buy. She wasn't covered in extravagant jewelry. She looked exactly like the woman Ethan had fallen in love with, graceful, humble, and radiant because of the joy she carried within her. As she slowly walked toward the altar carrying a bouquet of white roses, Ethan couldn't hold back his emotions. Every difficult moment they had endured flashed through his mind. The rainy evening that brought them together, the broken flower cart, the painful silence after the truth was revealed, the search that led him to Hope Haven. Every hardship had brought them to this single moment. The ceremony itself was simple. No dramatic speeches. No displays of luxury. Only promises built on honesty. When it came time to exchange vows, Ethan looked into Emily's eyes. I once believed success meant building companies, earning respect, and achieving goals most people considered impossible. Then I met you. You taught me that real success is measured by the lives we touch, the promises we keep, and the love we choose every single day. I promise that from this day forward, there will never again be a part of my life hidden from you. My greatest privilege is not being called a billionaire. It's being called your husband. Emily smiled through tears before speaking. I sold flowers because I believed even the smallest act of kindness could brighten someone's darkest day. I never imagined one flower would change my own life forever. You showed me that true strength isn't found in wealth or influence. It's found in humility, forgiveness, and the courage to admit when we've been wrong. I promise to stand beside you in every season, whether life brings celebration or hardship, because love only becomes meaningful when it remains through both. There wasn't a dry eye among the guests. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, applause echoed throughout the garden. Yet the greatest surprise came after the ceremony. Instead of hosting an extravagant reception focused on luxury, Ethan stepped onto the stage with Emily beside him. We have one final announcement, he said. For months, many people have asked what wedding gift we wanted. He smiled. The answer was none. A large screen behind them illuminated. It revealed the creation of the Brooks Carter Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping struggling families, supporting small business owners, providing medical assistance for caregivers, and creating scholarship opportunities for young people forced to postpone their education because of family responsibilities. The foundation's first projects had already been funded. Among them was a program providing flower carts and startup grants to street vendors hoping to build honest businesses of their own. Emily quietly squeezed Ethan's hand. The audience rose to its feet, not because they had witnessed extraordinary wealth, but because they had witnessed extraordinary generosity. In the months that followed, countless lives were changed through the foundation's work. Families received help during their most difficult moments. Young students returned to school. Small businesses reopened. Caregivers found support they never expected. And every year, on the anniversary of the rainy evening that first brought them together, Ethan and Emily visited the same downtown street corner where a simple flower cart had once stood. They never arrived with cameras. They never invited reporters. Instead, they quietly handed out free flowers to complete strangers. Some accepted with surprise. Some smiled. Some cried. None of them realized they were receiving flowers from one of the wealthiest couples in America. To Ethan and Emily, that didn't matter, because the greatest lesson of their story had never been about riches. It had always been about kindness. A single flower, given without expectation. A simple act that grew into a lifetime of love. And perhaps that's the most remarkable truth of all. The most valuable things we ever receive are often the ones that money could never buy. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments what part stayed with you the most. And if you believe kindness still has the power to change lives, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that hope can appear when we least expect it. Sometimes, one small act of kindness is enough to change the course of a life forever.